Hello and welcome to episode 1, or in fact episode 0 of my podcast, My Favourite Question. The first guest is me, Shaun. My friend Steve James graciously agreed to interview me for this podcast a while ago now. Okay, Steve and I, we actually studied together. We studied Latin and the great books of the West at the Alexander Arguelles Academy of Languages and Literatures. And Steve is a man of many talents, and you should definitely check out his podcast, Guru Viking. The link is in the description. Now, it was a while ago that Steve interviewed me. In fact, it was an embarrassingly long time ago. I don't want to say how long exactly, but that's the past. There are many reasons why that took a while to get done, but let's look to the future. The channel is now running, it is now going, so it's time to put this episode up. The idea of this episode was to introduce me, who I am, my ideas, why I study, what captures my imagination. Even though it was done a little while ago, and I am a little bit less hairy than I am today in the video, I was very surprised rewatching this weekend that it's pretty much all accurate. I still think a lot of the same ideas. If anything, they've become deeper or more strongly held or more developed. So it's still a very good representation of who I am and what I do and what I hope to do with this podcast. Apart from the part about it launching and being already, it should already exist. Ignore the part about my plan for it. The plan's changed a little bit, but here we go. Let's get started. Please enjoy the first podcast.
Well, Shaun, welcome to your podcast.
That's a strange thing to say, as we both know you're the one recording it and doing that. But yeah, thank you very much, Steve.
It is strange to welcome you to your own podcast, but that's what this episode is going to be all about. I'm going to be asking you questions about your life and your intellectual curiosities and your interests and so on, and what has led to you beginning this podcast, My Favorite Question. So let's begin there. The title of your podcast is My Favorite Question. What is your favorite question, and what is this podcast about?
It's a very simple question, and it's just why, which obviously never has a simple answer. That's kind of the point, really. It's always been... I know I was thinking about this, that it's always been something I've associated with. That's what I've done all my life, constantly asking why. Some of my earliest memories and stories are me saying why, and people tell those stories still when they reminisce about when I was younger. So that shouldn't be that strange, but I think I had it in overdrive, actually, compared to most people. And it's just persisted. It's never really stopped. People do actually have, if anything, I've upset people over the years with, come on, Shaun, just rest, like stop asking questions, stop. They get fed up sometimes. So certain people. So yeah, that's always been the way, how I've approached everything. I always want to know why. I want to know more. I want to know why it's true, why people say this is that, why it's that way. And that just felt, that just came to me one day. I decided about a year ago, actually. I wrote it down, and then I bought the URL, and it's just been in my mind since then, as I'm going to do that at some point. And it's not actually more planned out beyond that. That's really what it is. I see it as a way to have hopefully great conversations with other people and to keep learning. And I have more to say on why I think that might be interesting to anyone, but I'll just stop there for now. That's the basic idea.
Very interesting indeed. And I understand that the focus of this podcast is not on necessarily everything that one could ask the question why about, but actually some specific themes. So what is it in particular? What are the directions that you imagine or you envisage your podcast is going to be moving in?
My main interests are, or my main intellectual curiosities, I suppose, are the humanities. So anything related to history is usually number one, but also anything related to languages and literature. These all interest me, and I don't really see them as distinct disciplines in the way that they are taught or the way other people, they tend to be portrayed. or thought about. I see them all as one. They're just different versions of the same thing, really. That being said, I envision it more as I'm probably going to start with different series, shall we say, on the topics that I'm interested in. One of them will be, one of them definitely I'm going to start with some ancient Greek historians. I've already started getting in touch with people who hopefully will be interested to talk to me about them, because I have questions or some things I would like to know about. But and there will be some other like that might only be, I'll initially think of it as 5 to 10 episodes, and that might be it, or it might go and it might grow from there. That I don't want to put any limits on it in that sense. So right now I can say I'm interested in particularly ancient history, Romans, the Greeks, Western civilization, ideas, languages, literature, particularly short stories at the moment. I'm really into getting deeper and deeper into short stories, and I would like to go deeper into those. And that's how I'm going to start. And I hope that from there, other questions, I'm sure more questions will come, and we'll see where it goes.
Which short stories have you been reading lately?
So I have a book club, which we need to rename. I've got a series of more interesting, because originally it was going to be a book club, and it's become a short story book club, so it needs a better name. And I've got a few ideas for that, but these are non-native English speakers, and we go through these short stories in the same method that you and I go through the great books together, which is a separate thing that I'm sure that'll come up later. But we go through them in the same way, and so we've been doing a range of authors basically. We're just bouncing around the Western canon at the moment. Even reading, we've read. So now actually we're getting into the translations. So we've read Chekhov recently. We read some Chekhov, and we are going to read. I forgot the name of the man now. An Italian author whose name I've forgotten, but we're going to be reading him because the group is Russians and Italians, and they're keen to see more what it's like to read translations in another language. So that's the direction that's gone. That's been really interesting. I learned some interesting things about Chekhov and the differences between reading it in English and reading it in your mother tongue in Russian. But also we do, this week we read Ursula Le Guin, I think that's how you say her name. And we read this is the first kind of science fiction author we've read. We've also read P.G. Wodehouse, who I'm a big fan of P.G. Wodehouse, and there's a Roald Dahl is in the pipeline. Roald Dahl's adult short stories. So it's a real range. It just bounces around on the interest of what we've got at the moment. We read 2 short stories by the same author, so we get a real feel for that particular author, and it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. I've told everyone in the group if they all left next week, I would still continue this habit. It's become a really valuable thing of this 1 hour a week, because I sit down and read them for an hour, take intensive notes, so I'm ready for the group. It's it's something that I've always done actually, but not consistently. So now I'm enjoying doing it consistently.
And this is in the context, I assume, of your profession of coaching. You coach non-native English speakers in academic English and improving their English and so on. And this is part of that. Maybe you could say a little bit about that side of, I know you do a few things professionally. Maybe you could say a little something about that side of your life. Yeah.
So what you just said about me doing multiple things is the answer. I don't know if I'd call this coaching. This is I mean, these students I have. So I'll backtrack, start simply. So yeah, I've been a qualified English teacher for, foreign students since, coming up on 10 years now, 2013. And so I've done that. I've lived abroad, taught English in private language, always in the context of private language schools. Although in that context, I've also done a lot of work in state schools, particularly in Italy. So from that, I started teaching online before Zoom, before I became a Zoom professional in the overnight, basically. during lockdowns. From within 2 weeks, I went from doing occasional one-to-one lessons online to doing that basically all the time. And during lockdowns, during all of that, I had this idea, this vision for building an English community online for advanced learners, and that never quite got off the ground. It was successful. We kept doing it for a long time, but it never grew to a sustainable amount. And these are people, basically, the people who I still teach now, or I don't know if I teach, I read stories with them. We don't really teach. We read stories and we discuss them. It is much more of a literature circle than anything else. So that's one aspect of what I do. I also do professional coaching as well. I mean, that's also a very interesting challenge. You get much more into the mechanics of using the language. So I think they reinforce each other, talking about how to give a presentation in a higher stakes professional situation versus discussing what were we discussing the other day? We were discussing I can't remember the specific. There was we were discussing basically if society, how societies can be represented as both utopian and dystopian in a story. Where's the line? So these things are all connected, and that's what I do in terms of language coaching and working with language. I do translation work as well sometimes. I do translation jobs on the side. So yeah, I don't fit in that sense into a simple box of a single profession.
Speaking of foreign languages and translation and so on, I understand one of your great interests and passions is foreign languages, and you are something of a polyglot in that field. So I'm curious, what languages do you study? Can you say something about your language basket that you have and how that began, and in general about your interest for the study of foreign languages?
I mean, if I go right back to the beginning, it's pretty poor because I had 3 years of French at school, and I think I actually won the award. I won the award for being, when we get to year 9, so when we enter the final 2 years where we do our exams, I actually won the award. So for the first 3 years of high school or secondary school, I was the best at French in my year, and I dropped it immediately. As soon as I could drop that subject, I dropped it. And I don't know why, really. Looking back, well, I know why. I thought it was a waste of time. That was the attitude. But then throughout my studies and experiences in my early 20s, I just started getting more interested in languages and felt like it was this challenge this challenge, but also this thing I'd missed out on. I went to the Netherlands when I was 24 for an extended weekend holiday with a mate. But one of the things that came away from that trip was how interesting Dutch culture was. I wanted to learn more about it. The language looked really interesting. So I actually have the book here. I went and bought this like teach yourself Dutch book and started learning Dutch. And then I became an English teacher partly for the opportunity to travel and to work on languages. And I started getting into it. I got a big list of languages I wanted to learn, and then pretty much hit a roadblock very quickly, where even though I knew how to teach languages, and I do take that job seriously. I view it as a there are lots of cowboys in the language. That's a whole other subject. But in the private education industry, there are a lot of people who probably shouldn't be teaching languages, and I was probably one of those in the beginning. But I have taken it very seriously and got good at it. But I still was very bad at learning languages. I moved to Italy, lived there for a long time. And yeah, it took me almost 9 years, probably 7 years to get reasonably good at one foreign language, Italian. And it was actually through the Arguelles Academy of Languages and Literatures, which we're both a part of. And I'll probably mention that in the introduction as to how we know each other. So that'll make more sense. I got into this concept of, well, actually, if I really try and get better at foreign languages to a high level, that's a really worthwhile, valid, and difficult life pursuit or intellectual challenge that's really interesting. And I love literature, I love reading, so why not learn to do that in other languages? Up to this point, I thought that would basically be impossible, that it was above my level. Even though I got into specializing in teaching advanced English, the idea that I could do that in a foreign language just seemed impossible to me until about 3 years ago. And then I've kind of done a complete switch on that. So now you said something of a polyglot. I mean, I would still say aspiring polyglot. I know a lot about languages intellectually, but can I actually, do I know the languages well enough yet to say I'm a polyglot? Probably not. But definitely Italian. That's integrated into who I am. That's a big part of who I am and how I think and how I act and how I do things. But I've also now actively studying French, Latin, Greek, and just yesterday, I started on Russian. And that was something that I've come to decide. I've decided this next month is going to be a experimental month. I feel like I've been doing too much Latin and Greek.
Such a thing is not possible, Shaun.
Yeah, well, too much. I mean, not too much in the sense that I would like to do more. That's not. I don't mean too much in a negative way, but I think I put the ball down a little bit to focus on those, and I need to get back to trying to build a life where I'm doing all of these things balanced. So this month I'm going to experiment. I'm going to do a little bit of all the languages that I'm interested in for the future. So this month I'm going to be doing a little bit of Russian, a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of German. I might do Arabic, but I'm not optimistic on being able to add that. I think that's still a little bit above me yet. I need to get better I need to get better at the skill of learning languages. So that's a big part of my, it's a huge part of my everyday life actually now. It's a minimum of 1 to 2 hours every day, ideally more. It probably is more if you add up the days when I do extra classes, extra things. And that's something that I view as an ongoing pursuit that I'll be doing hopefully for the rest of my life.
Very interesting indeed. And why? I'm going to ask you your favorite question.
I was going to say, that's my question, isn't it? Why?
Why so many languages? I mean, an interesting collection of languages too, Latin and ancient Greek. They're said to be dead languages. Why would you want to study those? And why this sort of plethora of languages? What is it about those in particular and as a group that's drawing you?
I could probably talk for each one for easily 5 to 10 minutes, so I'll try to keep it as an overview. And if you want me to go deeper, I will. I mean, the basic idea of why learning a language is something that, going back to what I mentioned about French, one of the things that my French school experience, one of the things that was very prevalent at school, and I think is still prevalent in Britain today, is this idea that foreign languages are a waste of time. That was very prevalent in not just the education system, but even just the attitude of adults. At the same time, that where I live, you can see France on a clear day, not today, but on a clear day, you can see France. So it's not abstract. France is over there. And okay, maybe you don't need it for anything specific, but at the same time as most people think it's a waste of time, people also understand that they see it as a difficult thing. Rightly so. They see it as like, oh, that's difficult. That's a challenge. So there's a strange thing going on there in the way, and I was raised in that. So I thought about this a lot, how I view it now, and if I were giving advice to a teenager or trying to encourage a teenager to pursue this if they were interested in academic pursuits, is that it's not about learning a language for a particular. I mean, yes, you can learn it for an economic reason, you can learn it for traveling or very practical reasons, but the real reason to do it, if you're interested, is it opens up culture to you. It opens up an entire, especially for someone like me who wants to ask lots of questions and learn more. By learning another language, you have another chunk of the world that you can access. another group of people, another attitude to life, another culture to explore, another history, another everything, another way of then how that interacts with everything else. So that would be why I would say, if you, for an intellectual reason, that's why it's valid. I mean, there are other practical reasons. Like Russian is something I've always been interested in because I've studied Russian history extensively, particularly 20th century history, but also before that. And just the practical reason of being able, I remember in the past year during all the stuff that's been going on with Ukraine and everything, I remember thinking the whole time that even though I'm more well informed probably than I ever have been, I don't really know what's going on. And one of those limitations is you can't go directly to the Russian sources. So there's a practical reason for that. I've always been interested in going a bit deeper into Russian history, and now what's actually kicked me into doing that now is reading Chekhov with my group, with including 2 Russians in the group. So that I finally decided I'm going to commit to that. But back to the question of why that particular group of languages, or to summarize that, really is the fact that it's this idea of, I want to go deeper into Western civilization, which is why I've got these great books of the West behind me. Why that's which maybe that might not make sense to a lot of people. So maybe I'll just say these books here, these black books are all books which are part of the Western tradition. It starts down there at sort of Aristotle and goes all the way up to Freud. And the idea is that by reading these books, you get a deeper knowledge into Western history and Western culture and Western ideas. And that's something that I feel is really missing from our modern sense of who we are. It really is. The more I investigate, I mean, the question of why, like, why do we educate people the way we educate education is a big subject I'm interested in. And I do think a lot of the things we do, people don't really have a good answer. So why do you do that? And the idea that we don't teach people about their origins, the origins of ideas, why we don't discuss key ideas, that's not really a part of what the education system is, I would say. And this is my way of trying to get at it. This is probably a big part of actually a lot of the things I'm interested in. Like, I feel like I never got the opportunity to study Latin and Greek as a child. I probably would have wasted it for the reasons I've already given. So maybe that wasn't a negative thing, because I also now, that I don't hate it. That could actually be positive. But this is part of that desire to learn more about our origins, where we come from, and where our ideas come from, so that I can understand what's going on in the world much better. That's the end goal. There's a practical goal to it, but there's also there's an enrichment in the process. It's difficult, it's challenging, and it's just like going to the gym or doing exercise for me. Do you want to push yourself to something that's harder? And that's where languages fit into that. They allow me to do that at a higher level than I would be able to if I only read in English translation.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And your point there about Latin and Greek being something that you didn't have the opportunity to study. And I think that's true for most children in the UK. There are still some places where that's on the curriculum, but they're very few and far between.
It's 2.5% of primary school kids. 2.5%. So that's it. Yeah. And that's with there's been a push to incorporate it more into the curriculum in the past, say, 10 years than ever. So even with that push, it's 2.5%. I mean, in general as well, like the next one, so I'm good with memorizing numbers that I remember. It's something like French is something like 80% of kids will do French, but then the next one I think is German or Spanish, and it jumps right down to it's in the 20s. So you see very quickly that it's just languages in general are very. So in that sense, Latin's not that unusual, because most students in the country will only get the opportunity to study French, if anything, and that's a real. I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing, because I don't know. There's a whole question there of what should schools be teaching people. But I do think if we're going to build an education system, the idea that Latin wouldn't be prominent in it, or at least an option for those who are interested in languages, is kind of crazy. That's something I want to explore more of, actually. That's one of my questions. I would like to know if is this idea that teaching Western civilization as a concept, as a starting with studying Latin and Greek and going through learning the history of it and going through these great books behind us, is this something that actually has been tried and just they failed at incorporating it, or did they just leave it out of education for the masses in general? I don't know why. I suspect a lot of it was just never bothered with. A lot of it was always probably, maybe it was just, it's too hard to teach the masses about all of these things. I don't know if it was an intentional thing. That's something I'd like to, it's on one of my list of questions. I have a big list of, to go along with my favorite question. I have an ever growing list of questions. I write down ideas every day for things I'd like to investigate. And that's again, is one of the other motivations for doing this podcast. It gives me a format where I can start doing that in a creative and constructive way.
So the history of education, say in the UK, for example, and it might be interesting to compare that to places like Germany, France, and so on. That's an interest of yours as well, something you'd like to learn more about. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting subject. How has it changed, and what were the reasons for that change?
It is such a crucial part of why societies are the way they are today. So, as an example, every country, I've lived in the Netherlands and I've lived in Scotland. I was going to say Scotland. Then I've lived in Ireland, Italy, and both of those places have. I got quite into understanding the education system there, from talking to people, from interacting with it, and I mean there are just problems all over the place. Quite big problems, I would say. For example, in the Netherlands, one student explained it to me for his daughter. He was saying that his daughter's basically struggle. Basically, she's not going to have the opportunity to go to university because she was terrible at English. So they have the requirement in the Netherlands that you're not good at Dutch, English, and I think maths. I think those are the three things. You must get top marks or whatever the grade is in all of these. Otherwise, certain schools, certain types of education are just not open to you. Now, for everything I just said about languages and what the value I see in languages, the idea that you would deny someone access to university education in their own language because they don't speak English, I mean, that to me is, that's just crazy. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And we're talking about millions of young people, millions of people here. This is not like it's not a small thing. And in Italy, that's a crazy system there, because their education. I have a book. It's not on the shelf behind me. I have a book that I read in translation by an Italian writer called Giorgio Bassano, and in the book, he starts by talking. It's semi-autobiographical, and he starts by describing the education system, and it's identical to the system from today. It's identical, but he's writing in the 30s, so it hasn't changed. They've just kept the same system in Italy for 100 years. So yeah, and then you talk to people when you understand these things, and then you look at what's going on in these countries. You start to understand. Oh, that makes sense now. That's why these societies are evolving in the way they are. At least that to me makes sense. That's how I look at it. And that's also part of my when the things I'm interested in. I'm usually one of the things I was thinking about what we were going to talk about today, and thinking about why I am curious about things. And there was this. I did notice, I haven't got the answers to that question, but I necessarily in a simple format, but I was thinking about the nature of my curiosity, and it usually is very practical in nature. So for what it's worth, and that to me seems really obvious. If you want to understand a society, there are certain things you should look at, but I don't know if that's normal to have people to study the education of a society, for example, to understand that society. I don't know. That's not something that to me makes logical sense. I don't know if that's common. And there are lots of other things like that where this is part of the reason. Again, part of the reason why I wanted to do the podcast. So last year I was actually painting a house last year, and I got really into I was learning about ancient Greek philosophy whilst I was painting this house. I was all day just listening to these podcasts, and I had this moment of realizing, and also listening to other podcasts, I had this moment of realizing I need to start getting more involved. It's one thing to learn. But if you don't interact with other people and discuss these ideas, you're kind of, I don't know, it feels a bit like a waste. It feels like I should be interacting with other people and discussing them and trying to have that conversation out with other people. So that was also kind of the genesis of this idea for me as well. The first time I thought about it, thinking I want to be more involved in the conversation of these sort of issues that we have in society as well, and also things that I learn about. I want it to be something that's a bit more than just me sitting in this room reading it, and then I have dinner with my girlfriend and tell her all about it. And sometimes she finds it really interesting, and other days she's just like, okay.
True love is listening to your partner tell you about Plato again.
No, she gets interested in the things I'm interested in. She's interested in it but I'm sure a lot of it is, she knows it makes me happy to talk about it with her.
Yeah, of course.
So part of the benefit of finding other people to talk about these things is she can have a break.
That's very funny. Yeah, so that's interesting. So I think I'm getting a sense now more and more of the scope of your intellectual curiosity. Languages, yes, but also the history of civilizations and countries, Western civilization in particular, but it doesn't take you long to start questing beyond that. And what about the history of education, different educational models, and how have they come to be, and how have they changed, and what effects might we observe, or at least speculate about, what effects could we speculate about between education and other factors in a country's trajectory and so on. Yeah, it's a very interesting, rich area of inquiry. So I'll be very interested to listen to your episodes as they go into those sorts of themes, and you have people to discuss those with. That'll be very cool. I wonder if we might talk about your background, schooling, I suppose, your family of origin, where you've grown up, south of England, from what I understand. And I know you've had an interesting relationship despite the fact that you love learning, you've had an interesting relationship to education throughout your life, particularly teens and 20s and so on. So I'm curious, I guess, about that too, your interaction with official channels of education, being as you are such an intellectually curious person.
Yeah, I mean, I've grown up I always lived in the same place until I went to university, and that was in Kent, on the coast, and the southeast of England, as you said. So in that sense, that's quite typical, I guess. It's quite typical of the average English person, because a lot of us live in the southeast. And I didn't even have a concept. I remember a friend at university saying he lived in the southeast, and I remember saying, "Well, you don't live in the southeast. What are you talking about?" And he said, "Yes, I did. I was born in Woking, and Woking to me was, I didn't even know that the boundaries of the southeast extended that far. It's the other side of London, as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, I'm from the real southeast in that sense, because you can't go any further." But there's a lot of people, I think, we live in this bubble, this London-centric bubble, which has just grown. And that, yeah, when I go to do manual, physical work, I now go up to London to do it, and it's a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, I have to drive a long way, and my dad does it every day, and so do many of my friends and many people I know. They drive 1 to 2 hours each way every day to commute to London. So I guess it's quite typical in this sense. A large proportion of British people live in this way. So in that sense, nothing unusual. I came, Came from a very, very average, if anything, quite poor, depressed English town, which again is not uncommon if it's on the seaside. Parents grew up in I'm not going to say poor family. We weren't poor. We just didn't have a lot. But I had the fortune to grow up with parents who, well, we had a very more traditional growing up experience in that sense, because my mum stayed at home, my dad just worked, my mum looked after us. So I had a very good childhood in that sense, although we didn't have a lot materially. And in terms of education and how that ties into it, I was thinking about this a lot beforehand, and I don't really know why, because I was actively discouraged, I would say, if anything. My parents were very, as I've just said, gave me a very good upbringing by any standards, but they did not encourage me to pursue education. But I was very good at it. I was very good, although very bad at exams, very bad at writing, and very bad at exams. By writing, I mean handwriting, but excellent at all the other things. So it was a bit weird. In fact, I actually remember I remember doing, when we had our exams, we had these exams when we were about age 11, and the welfare officer, I guess they'd be called today, I don't know. Someone in the school spoke to my parents and they said, "We'd like to give Shaun more help with his handwriting. The problem is, his handwriting qualifies as special needs, but I was in the gifted and talented kind of group as well. So they couldn't justify giving me extra help for the handwriting." I don't know if that's relevant, but that was, so yeah, quite strange. On the one hand, I've always been very good at education. I've enjoyed it a lot. And on the other hand, education in terms of schooling. On the other hand, not a genius or anything. Just I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed learning the things I enjoyed, but very bad at exams, very bad at preparing for exams. So I didn't do that well when it came to the higher education. But I was in this. I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse that I went to university. I'm now it definitely opened doors for me. I mean, I shouldn't say it's a curse. It's definitely not, because it opened doors for me. It gave me an opportunity to move away and live somewhere else, have different experiences. But I do often think, well, to be honest, I also wasted that time a lot. But I was in this age group of people in the early 2000s where we were, or mid 2000s, sorry, where we were being encouraged. The government had a plan to get everyone into university, get 50% of young people into university. So for that reason, I went to university, not because I actually took a gap year. And in that gap year, I was working with my dad doing building work, and we were doing renovation work. So I was in there ripping out ceilings and coming home from work every day covered in dust and everything, just making some money to save for when I went to university. I was going to study law, and I had to have a place set up to study law. And the only reason that really was a thing was because I looked at other options, and every other option I looked at, there was this thought of, well, what am I going to do with that? That was the problem. That's why I didn't put myself down to study history. Anthropology was another thing I went to look at. I was interested in anthropology. I considered music for a while, and just recognized that all these things, they didn't see much benefit. I won't say too much about music. I don't want to offend you about the much benefit in doing a music degree necessarily, especially with my level of music ability. So I decided on law because that made more sort of that made my parents happy as well. They were like, we understand that you can go do law, and then there's a path there, and that made sense to me as well, because it was a lot of money, a lot of time. But then I actually resat an exam just for fun the following year. I resat one of my history exams, and having that breath from education and just going to study history for 6 weeks to prepare for an exam because I really wanted to do it. I basically aced that test, and I realized, I upped my entire history grade from my A-level history grade, and realized, history is what I should be doing. This is what I really love. I'm just going to do it. So I changed to history, and I studied history. And that was, again, even that was weird, talking about me being diverse in my activities and how it's never quite straightforward. By changing degree, I changed campus. So I then became the only person. I couldn't change. I already had my place, and I had my place of where I lived. So I became the only person on this one campus living there that every day had to travel across the town to the other campus, which meant I had friends who were all studying business, lots of computer games design, marketing, events management. These were my friends I lived with, and then my friends at uni were at uni. My classmates were obviously studying history or humanities subjects. So I was in like different worlds, even throughout my university experience. So yeah, that's been my thing with education. I've looked at other courses since then. I've looked at going deeper into education, but there's always this question of like, what am I going to do with this? What's the point in this? And I feel like a lot of higher education is, a lot of it is not. That's a whole other subject, really. But it's not been enough to pull me back into it. There's not been enough benefit I just can't justify spending 1, 2, 3 years, 4 years paying for education in something that's not going to allow me to. Well, for one thing, it's not going to allow me to get a good job that's actually going to pay for my life. That was one concern. But the second concern with pursuing higher education further has always been, there's not one thing. I don't want to specialize. There's not one thing I want to specialize in that much. Nowadays, I'm a bit more clear on what I'm interested in. So maybe I will. I probably will at some point in the future go back to education and pursue graduate degrees. But there's always been this kind of thing of, I understand the system and how it works and what it is, so it keeps me a little bit skeptical of it.
And when you say you've considered masters, I suppose is what you're thinking there, graduate degrees, masters of various types. You've really seriously considered it and flirted with the idea.
I've applied. I've been there. Yeah. I've been there and done day one and left, actually.
Okay, so tell me about that then. Tell me about that. I have 3 questions, first of all. Why do you think you're so drawn to that? Number 1. Number 2, why did you leave those masters that you began? And number 3, you've said that you still feel, you might do that. What do you think you're going to do? What would you like to do in sort of ideal world?
So the first one, I've enrolled twice. The first one was just directly out of university. I enrolled in a master's course in history as I was finishing my degree. And that was always I might do it, I might not. So there's no real great answer why I didn't do it. I just weighed up the cost and just thought this is not, it's not worth it. But then a couple of years later, I then applied to the same university and applied for a different degree, that time in American studies. And the reason why I chose that was because it just seemed like a great way to combine. It combined all of the things I was interested in at the time. I studied a lot of, I mentioned 20th century history, which included America, obviously. America was a big part of what I studied. My dissertation was on the Vietnam War. The Cold War was the Cold War in particular, Soviet history and the way they all combined, that was a big interest. The Cold War is fascinating to me because it's so recent but already forgotten by everyone, basically. It's barely spoken about. I think as so many people, well, basically our age and down, don't even know what it is. So that's a whole that's crazy to me, but that's the way we are as a species. So American studies combined these interests of mine. It was meant to be a combination of politics, history, and literature. So I thought, this is great. This is perfect. And then in reality, it wasn't. A lot of the modules that I'd wanted to do were not being offered. I found out were not being offered that year. I kind of compromised. I went there on the first day, and I just got this sense of it's not worth what I'm paying for it, let alone there was a Chinese girl in the class who I presume was on an international, because she didn't sound British. She sounded Chinese. So I'm presuming she was paying international rates. which is a lot more than double. It's just not worth it. So I had that sense of this is just not worth it, and walked out that day and drove home and had to come up with a new plan. And I tried freelance writing for a year, but that's another story. That's another thing I've done. Actually, I don't do it now, but I've done freelance writing for a while, copywriting and that kind of thing, and a little bit of journalism too. That's another thing that helped me to understand the way all these things work. So when things are not really presented the way they seem, when things are presented in a way that differs from the reality, that just doesn't work with me. That just infuriates me, and I can't do it. So that's why I've not done it. Okay, so back to number one. Why have I been drawn to it? So that's I don't really know. I mean, it just seems like the logical way to go. Like if you're interested in learning and you like learning, it makes sense to pursue higher education. But I've never had that luxury of, well, someone's going to pay for me to do it, so I can just take my time with it, or I can take risks from it. I've never had any guidance either. That's always something that I recognize now was an issue. If anything, going to university was kind of a strange and actively discouraged thing in my family. My dad only really understood it years later, when he understood that, oh, okay, well, because Shaun did that, he was able to become a teacher and go and live in Italy and have a good life there. So for him, that then made sense, I think. But that was like, okay, now I understand. That wasn't a waste of time. At the time, he thought, what is he doing, going and studying history? Which I can understand. And I think that's the thing with it. I've been drawn to it because that just seems logical. But then I don't do it because when I get these periods when I do research into things, and I do the research and find it's just not what I want it to be. I think part of it also is that main thing of, as I mentioned before, there's not one thing I want to specialize in. So that makes it trickier to justify doing it, whatever it is I find that's interesting. I've looked at so many different courses, so many different universities over the years, and they never live up to what I'm trying to do, or what I'd like to do, which basically is which I don't know. I guess, yeah, that's part of the problem. I didn't necessarily know what that was until more recently, where I've spent more time. I can now articulate more clearly what it is and what it is I enjoy about learning and what I would like to learn. So you mentioned, back to the Western civilization thing. There's an argument put forward in the first book of this series, book 1, that we should focus on learning about our own civilization first, because it's only through a deep understanding of our own civilization that we can ever come to truly know other civilizations well. Which I think that there's a lot of truth to that. In order to understand the world better, I do think it makes sense to understand your own culture more deeply. So that's where I am now. So I do think that's why I'm so pulled to ancient history in particular. And I do see myself going down that route at some point. I do see myself perhaps studying some aspect of, I'm not sure yet, ancient Greece or Rome. I could actually see myself specializing in a very specific part of that, with a view that you do that to get a deeper understanding of the craft that then allows you to then explore. I wouldn't be content with only one part of that. I don't see, again, but one of the advantages of studying classics is actually they do seem to combine language, literature, and history into one. So maybe that's also why I'm more drawn to it. Although the fact that it's completely isolated off, this is the negative part. The fact classics is so isolated off from history makes zero sense to me. And I don't understand why that is. But that's something I can see me studying in the future in some aspect. It seems to encompass all the things I'm interested in. And I can see it as I don't see that as isolating me into one area, because it would actually, in my mind, open up all of Western history and civilization and knowledge to me. That might be a bit idealistic, though. I don't know.
If you had to choose one between Latin and Greek, which would you choose? Maybe that's an unfair question. Sophie's choice.
In terms of the language,
I don't know. Any terms you like.
if you're only studying, I mean, okay, if you studied only Greece and Greek and you did, pre-Roman, then I think you'd be all right. In the sense that you could do that. You could study the works of Aristotle, or Herodotus, or the classical Greek period on its own terms with Greek, and you can get that there's a lot there. But once you get to the Romans, to study the Romans without knowing about Greek and Greek culture and how those civilizations are interacted, you're missing a big part of the picture. So, I mean, if you had to say, if I could only choose one language if you could say you could only study one language, I mean, it probably would only, I couldn't choose one. I mean, I like them in different ways, though. I mean, Latin is easier. I won't lie. Latin is just so much easier. And that's how I feel now. So that might change as I get better at Greek. It might change there. But that's part of what's so fascinating, and it's how they interact. That's a big part of it. I don't think you can separate them, or if you do, you're missing a big part of the picture. And you could say that about everything, really. Like almost every language, every culture, there's always going to be more. Back to my original point about why learn other languages. By learning about them, learning about other cultures and other languages, you get another way of looking at something. So you could argue that about everything, but those two cultures in particular are very intertwined. And just think about the fact that the average Roman citizen, nobleman, probably would have been raised and taught to be bilingual by their Greek slaves / teachers, professors. So to those people. So if you want to read people like Julius Caesar, if you want to read his works, or Cicero, to those people, they were bilingual, most probably, a lot of them. So again, if you're already studying one of the languages or one of the cultures, you're still, even there, you're missing out a little bit, I think.
Official educational channels, university degrees of various types, that's one thing you've explored a lot. But you're also a fierce autodidact and have pursued, if you want, unofficial educational channels as well. Of course, your own study. But also, you mentioned before Professor Alexander Arguelles' Academy. And that's how we met, actually. I've studied Latin together. We've read great books together. And that academy teaches a range of languages. It's tremendous, world-famous polyglot. And Professor Alexander Arguelles offers many languages there. For example, I'm studying also Sanskrit with him. He teaches Old Norse, Arabic. Really, he has a passion and interest in world languages and in also world culture. So that's how we met. So I'm curious how it was you came upon Alexander Arguelles and why it is you decided to join his academy. And in general, your impulse for being an autodidact.
Start with the autodidactic part, because that's also like my reason, like part of my motivation for joining the academy was to develop those skills. So I sort of see it as, you said fierce autodidactic. I might say that's a bit strong. I would say I would say aspiring again. I feel like I'm still learning. I feel like I'm still learning how to be more disciplined, how to learn better, how to be a more effective autodidactic. In particular now, at the age I am now, whereas it's like I feel like I put the ball down in my 20s, so to speak.
What do you mean by that?
Like I was getting good at, particularly towards the end of university. I took it seriously. I still did a lot of what the average student does, i.e., I drank a lot more than I should have done. In general, that was a mistake, perhaps, but I took it seriously. And by the third year, I was getting really good at it. I was getting really organized. I was, just again, I had lots of friends studying business, and they were quite the opposite. Business students got away with a lot more drinking, a lot less intensive study, because it's a different type of discipline. So I saw different sides of the student life there. And so I put the ball down, really. I kind of stopped. Now, I always kept going a little bit, but not intensively. So I've always, basically, Wikipedia has been my greatest friend for most of my, also the internet in general. That's a big thing. I've never been, I've always loved reading, but for a long time I stopped reading, and I learned a lot through PC, through those old PC, not really games, like software, like that would teach you things. So I was there, like, using computer games, not even games. They're more like encyclopedic. I don't even know what they're called now. It's a genre of software that doesn't exist. They were like digital encyclopedias. If you remember those things, if you ever had those, I don't know. So I was doing things like that from a young age. And then, in my 20s, I just really stopped doing anything too intensively or seriously. And it wasn't something I struggled with getting into language learning, despite having, studied to be a language teacher. I still struggled to become an effective language learner. But I've always read a lot of things online. In particular, I've always had this voracious appetite for more knowledge. So it's kind of been bubbling away. But I wanted to get more serious about it. And part of that desire to get more serious about it actually came from doing my own English community. So I had this idea that I really needed to become an independent teacher. I did the maths and I worked it out that there's just no like long-term future in being a teacher for other schools. You need to build something from that. If you want to have if you want to do more, basically, because the only way you make more money teaching is you teach more, and then you're more tired, you don't have any time to study. And I had this idea that a lot of my most successful classes, or the way my classes have gone, and how the things that were most appreciated by my students usually came from the things I was studying on my own. That's what I know. So I had this knowledge, this kind of not knowledge, this idea came to me over time that part of the flaw of the education system, I guess, is in many ways is the fact that a lot of teachers also come straight. They only teach. So that's a bit of a negative in many ways. They only teach. And I really think teachers should be curious. Teachers should be the people who are curious and are out there like pushing themselves, and then trying to basically disseminate this information, to people who can be bothered to read it and to try to challenge themselves and grow in whatever areas they did, then disseminate that down and try to pass some of that information on to the right students. That's a bit more of my vision of how I think education should be done, ideally. So that's a long way of saying that during that process, I started my own community. I was making content for them. I've always been much more creative. Teaching was great for me in a creative sense because you can just do what you want, basically. If you're outside of the state education system, you can do what you want. As long as they're happy, that's the main thing, because they're paying for it, so they have to be happy. And on the other hand, as long as I know they're making progress and I know it's working, I don't need to tick boxes. So that's where I started there. And in terms of coming up with I was trying to help my students get better at learning vocabulary, and that's where I discovered the professor. Funnily, I remember exactly how I found it, and it's one of those pure chance, roll the dice things where I saw a comment. I watched a video about how to learn Japanese characters, like kanji, from manga, which is not one of my interests at all, but it was a recommended video. And in the video, he talked about lots of things, including the professor, and there was a link. And I watched that video of the professor where he's the Polyglot's daily study training program or something, one of his earliest, most sort of successful videos. where he's talking about, he's just being interviewed and talking about all the languages he was studying in one day. And I watched that and it was just inspiring. And I shared it with my students, many of which are still in my book club now. And they all had the same reaction of, oh, we need to stop making excuses about why we're struggling to do half an hour of English every day. Look what this man is doing. This is clearly, we can do more. And so then I started following his, reading up his essays online, his all sorts of things, watching some of his videos over the next year. And that's when I started getting more into it as well. When I had that inspiration that I could get better at Italian in my case. But it really took longer. It took longer than that for me still took me a long time to get into it. And when he announced he was going to open his academy, it was quite sad actually for me when I looked at it was a bit sad when I looked at the list of all the initial programs and realized, well, I can't do any of these. Italian is the only one I'm good enough at to perhaps read literature at that point, and that's not an option. But there was the great books, and I thought, well, I was already convinced on the idea. I hadn't bought the set yet. I hadn't really investigated in it. I'd just seen his videos online about it. I'd never heard of the concept before, and it did seem quite crazy to me that it's not a part of the idea that you would just read. We mentioned this. I said this to you recently that I've got Karl Marx is in this collection over here, and I've got another copy of Karl Marx somewhere, but I've never read it. And the Communist Manifesto and its ideas is, I studied Soviet history for 3 years at university, and it was never actually a part of the reading. Like, you never had to read it. That's an unfortunate it's an unfortunate part of the system, this idea that you should go back and read these older texts doesn't seem to apply. So yeah, the concept got me, and then that's why I joined the first part. I joined the Great Books course. Together we started reading Herodotus and Thucydides, and from there I've gone on to join other classes, and it's just grown. The biggest mistake was joining the language learning support group, because if you join that group, you pretty much if you don't want to, if you're worried, you're not a part of that class, and if you don't want to find yourself learning more languages, you shouldn't join that class, because that's what happens. It's inspiring. I've decided, all right, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm now going to add, and that's how I ended up adding more languages. And I think that's and a big part of that was learning how to learn properly. Learning how to learn on my own properly has been a big part of why I've continued to do it and why I'm still doing it, because there's an art to. I see it as an art. There's an art to learning, to being an autodidactic studier. That's you could probably spend the rest you can probably spend the rest of your life working on it, and it wouldn't be a waste of time. It filters down into everything in your life, because you have to align all of the things in life so that you can achieve big goals. So that's why I continue to do it, and I have no intention of stopping.
Yes, Professor Arguelles is a wonderful teacher, and of course very remarkable in his own intellectual achievements, but also I think remarkable in his emphasis on encouraging us and empowering us to learn ourselves. That seems to be his a big part of his ethos. He wants to help us learn how to teach us. He wants to teach us to teach ourselves, in a sense. And of course, along the way, he's teaching us a great deal of other things too. Well, this has been so fascinating. I wonder, as I expect we're coming towards the end of our conversation here, we've talked about so many things. We've talked about your favorite question. What is it? It's the question why. And we talked about your various interests and how you intend to bring those into the podcast. And we've talked about your own background and your own relationship to learning, both in official education contexts like universities and so on, and also as an autodidact and in renegade contexts like the Professor's Academy and so on. So I'm wondering, is there anything else left to say? Anything else on your mind you want to to say before we wrap this up?
I don't know really. I mean, I think we've covered everything. So I'm looking at this. I don't have notes that I'm looking down at. I've had a pen the whole time, but I've not been taking any notes. I'm not reading notes. I'm just looking at all this writing I did in advance to prepare, thinking about it. And that's the more I think about why do this, it's actually less clear. At the same time, the feeling that it's a valuable pursuit and the right thing to do becomes more solid in my mind. So in that sense, I know I've mentioned this to you. We spoke about it, I think back in May, and I've mentioned it to you, and I've spoken about it with my girlfriends. But otherwise, it's not been something I've been able to talk about much. I don't really have anyone. I don't have many people apart from the people in the academy that I study with, and my girlfriend is very supportive of these things to talk about with these. So thank you. I wanted to thank you, Steve, because you said basically you kind of decided I'm going to do it this week, didn't you? You said, right, let's do it. When I asked you if you'd interview me for it, and I've been getting ready to do it for a while. I had in my head, I had to get some other things done, and I would start it around this time of the year. But whether I would have necessarily pulled the trigger this week, well, I wouldn't have unless you had said, yeah, let's do it. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was an honor to be asked to interview you for episode 0. And I do admire your, what did I call it? Fierce autodidactic impulse and your intellectual curiosity, as well as your discipline. Actually, I see you as a very disciplined person in my experience of you. You're very disciplined in these things as well and creative. So I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful podcast, and I wish you the best of luck with it.
Thank you very much.